It was a normal day in February of 2005, and the SCP Foundation was running about as well as it ever was. Researcher Lillian Marley was about to give a routine presentation on her heuristic for calculating Ackermann function values for m over 50. Lillian was a level 3 containment specialist who had had a bachelor's degree in computer sciences and had been with the Foundation since 1999. At the time, she was 28 years old and was already a prominent member of junior staff, thanks to her work ethic and superlative research skills. She worked on a team led by head researcher Christopher Byrnes and was known by her coworkers for always going above and beyond. But outside of her skills in computer science, she was a perfectly average young woman. Lillian didn't know it yet, but that was all about to change. She loaded up the next slide on her presentation, which was meant to be a graph comparing two types of algorithm. What showed up on the next slide instead was, let's just say it was material that was too hot for the delicate researcher team's eyes. It was a sight so shocking that it drew gasps from the audience. She tried to turn it off, but the computer refused to cooperate. The worst part was, she hadn't even downloaded anything explicit onto her laptop. It was the most embarrassing thing that had ever happened to researcher Lillian in her entire life. Human resources were swiftly called in, and Lillian was punished with a pay cut and was required to submit all of her personal electronics for a bi-weekly audit by IT. Now, that on its own might have just been a humiliating glitch, but over the next few weeks, Lillian's technology continued to act up. Computers and phones would short-circuit when she tried to use them. Files would delete themselves from her account the day she was supposed to send them for review. Her text messages would end up garbled to the point of being incomprehensible, or would spontaneously change to create inappropriate spelling mistakes like "I lick you" instead of "I like you." Most concerningly of all, her electronic payments would get wired to the wrong accounts, and emails she sent containing sensitive information would be sent to random non-Foundation personnel. It stopped looking like a coincidence, and it started looking like a potential anomaly. Lillian was withheld for testing and was given the designation SCP-8980. It was assumed that whatever strange phenomenon had plagued Lillian would eventually disappear, allowing her to return to her role as a Level 3 researcher. It was a job she genuinely loved, despite head researcher Byron's relentless knack for being condescending. Byrnes went even further with his request to be made lead on the investigation into Lillian's anomalous properties. She sat in the lab, being tested by all kinds of medical instruments, while Byrnes and his team took notes. Lillian hoped that once he was done conducting tests on her, she could take some time off and get a break from having to be around him. She never expected to be in containment for more than a few days. Unfortunately, every test came up negative. She had no residual thaumaturgical energy, she showed no evidence of being subject to reality abstraction, and the results of the test meant to determine if another anomaly was acting on her came back inconclusive. It meant that Lillian had to remain in containment. The worst part was having to sit for interviews with Dr. Byrnes. She always suspected he felt threatened by her success. He never did show much respect to the Foundation's female employees. Every time she corrected a mistake of his or noticed something that he didn't in her research, she could tell it really frustrated him. And now she couldn't get work done at all while Dr. Byrnes got to treat her like a patient instead of a peer. He didn't do a very good job of concealing his amusement at the situation. He would show up late to the interviews and couldn't stop himself from snickering whenever Lillian expressed her annoyance at being kept in containment. Week after week, they did more tests. They got her to play Minesweeper on an old Dell laptop, and she triggered a bomb on her first turn in 58 games in a row. She was assigned a desktop computer and tasked with solving a series of 100 math problems. But as she began working, a string of baffling software errors interrupted her progress, blocking her from entering the correct answers. In both tests, Lillian refused to keep going after a point. She started to get so frustrated that it was giving her a headache. In another experiment, she was given a TV and allowed to watch whatever she wanted. She was able to watch nature documentaries with no major interruptions for 7.5 of the allotted 8 hours. But for the last 30 minutes, the channel abruptly switched to The Wiggles, and nothing anybody could do was able to change it back. All the while, the researchers got no closer to finding the source of this anomaly. There was no traces of malware or hacking on any of the devices Lillian used, nor was there any evidence of anti-memetic or unusual temporal activity. However, one thing was clear about every manifestation of Lillian's anomalous properties. They always managed to be utterly humiliating. It wasn't just bad luck. It was like some external intelligence was following her around and doing whatever it could to embarrass her. Following that discovery, Byrnes and his team looked for evidence of interference from an Akiva-based entity, which is Foundation speak for, quote, divine punishment. But this was quickly ruled out. Even though Lillian had Catholic parents, she hadn't been involved with any church since she was 15 years old. Byrnes made sure to let Lillian know that he was doing everything he could to resolve the issue, and that he would get back to her as soon as possible with any concrete results. The testing continued, however. Lillian was out of work for months, and she was climbing the walls with boredom. The only entertainment she was allowed to have were books and magazines from the Foundation's employee lounge, which was a meager offering. They had to find a way to let her go back to work. As the tests dragged on, she wondered what her mother must be thinking. They didn't get on very well and hadn't spoken in a little while, but still Lillian didn't like the idea that any of her family might be worrying about where she was right now. The Foundation had taken her phone and didn't let her log into her email, so there was no way of letting anyone outside the Foundation know that she was okay. Test after test came back negative. Lillian's professional attitude completely fell away as she started antagonizing Dr. Byrnes in interviews. She tried to revoke her consent to being contained. Dr. Byrnes laughed at her for even suggesting such a thing. Once she'd been put in anomaly containment, she'd lost all right to do that. In another test, Byrnes and team tried to see if location had something to do with the anomaly. Lillian was taken to a remote location without any electrical or internet connection and given a laptop to set up. The task should have been simple, but she faced incredible difficulty doing it. The operating system would randomly restart. The laptop would change languages, and she never seemed to be able to select the correct options. Eventually, she was able to get the laptop started, but the whole experience left her feeling tired and frustrated. She asked for the rest of the experiment to be terminated. The test seemingly confirmed that whatever was happening, Lillian was the source of it. Next, she was put in a room with multiple electronic devices to see if the presence of multiple devices could dilute the anomaly's effect. She was asked to pick any item in the room and interact with it. Lillian picked up a BlackBerry phone and started to play Brick Breaker. She enjoyed the game for a few minutes, but then the screen froze and out of nowhere, the phone started dialing a number. The phone rang a couple times, then a familiar voice picked up. It was Michael Crawford, a man that Lillian had briefly dated in college, and he was just as confused to get a call from her as she was. Mortified, Lillian tried to hang up, but the phone refused to cooperate. Michael and Lillian proceeded to argue for about 15 minutes, until Lillian got so angry that she smashed the phone to pieces. Just to be safe, the Foundation tracked Michael down and administered some amnestics. The next test was to judge how feasible it would be to give Lillian her job back. She was given a pencil and paper and asked to write lines in the programming language C, which she was very familiar with. Once she wrote the program, she could put it through a slot in the wall, where a remote system would interpret her handwriting and print out the requested output information for Lillian. The test went smoothly, and it was determined that by using this method, Lillian would be able to resume her work as a Foundation researcher. But despite all her hopes, this did not lead to her designation being lifted. Her anomalous effect was still deemed too much of a security risk. After taking a few days to adjust to the new system, Lillian was soon working at the same level of productivity she'd shown before her anomaly manifested. During this time, she also showed a slightly improved mood, but that increased mood didn't last long. Lillian was still frustrated, and who wouldn't be in her situation? Her coworkers were still treating her like a zoo animal, and even though she had her job back, she was alone for 16 hours every day. Thanks to her anomaly, she was unable to listen to music, so the silence of her cell was starting to drive her mad. She took up these complaints with Dr. Byrnes, and true to form, he dismissed them. According to him, she should be fine. She was never very social in the first place. Lillian snapped at him, saying that she was sick of seeing his ugly, stuck-up face all day. She was going to take her complaint higher up the chain and file a request for reassignment. In the request form, she claimed she was being denied her rights. and was subject to belittling and verbal abuse from Dr. Byrnes. Dr. Byrnes responded to this by saying he'd always been close friends with Lillian, and that he really cared about her well-being. No matter what she said, he always thought they'd made a great team. All those times he called her Lily, which got on her nerves, or when he'd called her a ballbuster, or asked if it was that time of the month, it was all just joking around between co-workers. In fact, Dr. Byrnes was so worried about his friend Lillian's mental state, especially after she'd snapped at him, that he would personally see that her provisional containment was extended, for her own safety, of course. He also requested that she see a therapist as soon as possible, to get to the root cause of her tantrums. Dr. Byrnes gave her some forms to fill out if she wanted to abort testing, saying that he wouldn't be able to cancel testing based on verbal requests alone. The forms would require 3 business days of notice. Lillian wasn't having any of it. She knew even if she filled those forms out, Byrnes would find a way to accidentally misplace them. So the tests continued. She was instructed to heat up some Foundation rations in the microwave. The microwave surged and the rations exploded. She was instructed to read some text to an experimental analog text-to-speech transcriber, and the words came out completely different to what she had said. She wasn't even in the same room as the machine for this test. In another test, a laptop was put in her cell. She never touched it, but it would turn off and on at random. The loud startup noise would startle Lillian and cause her distress. Despite this, she refused to touch it. By the end of the test, she was in tears. After one test where seemingly nothing happened, Lillian started vomiting on the floor of the test chamber and was immediately taken to the on-site hospital. No medical conditions were detected, and the doctors concluded that her illness was the result of anxiety and poor nutrition. Lillian was at her wits' end. It had been 6 months by this point. Dr. Byrnes tried to tell her to calm down, but she leapt across the table at him. She wrestled him to the ground and tried to steal his keys, but he fended her off by kicking her in the chest. After this incident, Lillian was required to speak to a therapist. Her therapist's advice? Treat her containment like a challenge instead of a defeat, and treat it like a challenge she did. Using her knowledge of computer code, she was able to hack her remote system to send messages to people outside of the Foundation, including her mother. Unfortunately, she was caught, and the punishment for her actions would have to be Class C amnestics. And by chance, the supervising researcher put in charge of her post-amnestic orientation was Dr. Byrnes. Lillian fought the whole way to the procedure. She begged the anesthesiologist not to go through with it, but the doctor didn't want to lose her job. She administered the drugs, and despite Lillian's cries and screams, left her alone with Dr. Byrnes to have her memories altered. As instructed, he erased her memories of exploiting the remote system, and her memories of contacting people outside the Foundation. But just for fun, he also removed some of her personal memories that were unrelated to Lillian's escape attempt. The records of what exactly he made her forget have been damaged, but it's fairly certain that whatever it was very important to Lillian. This was what completely broke her. During the next interview she had with head researcher Byrnes, Lillian broke down in tears and begged him to give her memories back. She told him that she'd do anything he wanted. She'd take whatever terrible assignments he didn't want. She'd let him take credit for writing every paper she ever wrote. She'd take a pay cut, become his secretary, and make him a coffee and a sandwich every day. She even offered to sleep with him if that's what he wanted her to do. Dr. Byrnes just laughed at her. He didn't need any of those things. He'd already taken everything he wanted. He had made her life miserable and made her feel pathetic and alone. Before he left the interview room, he smiled smugly and wished Lillian a happy 1-year anniversary to her containment. Then he left, and Lillian picked herself up off the floor where she'd been crying and got ready to start her workday. Years later, in 2014, Dr. Byrnes retired from his work at the Foundation. Around the same time, Lillian's anomalous effects on technology mysteriously stopped. In 2015, Lillian was released from containment.